Welcome to the ZNL Podcast, a podcast brought to you by ZN, the OG digital agency in Brussels.
Hello and welcome to this edition of ZNL. I am very excited today to have a special guest, somebody that I was on a panel about AI and associations only a week ago, Natalia Kurop. Now, Natalia, you have a very, very interesting backstory, starting your career at the BBC, working on documentaries, TV programs, and then moving, and that's what we're going to find out soon, to Brussels and working in the association world until you are now a headhunter. So welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm excellent. Thank you for the invitation.
Very, very happy to have you. So basically the question that I always like to hear, especially from the people who have often a very broad international background, is what brought you to Brussels in the first place?
Well, happy accident. Love brought me and politics kept me. So I think being a European by nature, but not necessarily by birth, coming to Brussels actually felt like a homecoming, ironically, because war sent us out of Europe and politics kept me in Europe. So that's what brought me to Brussels. And I've enjoyed 17 years of a happy, interesting, diverse career since I arrived in 2008.
So you started at the BBC on kind of journalistic perspective, and then when you came to Brussels, then you kind of entered immediately into the association world, or what was the transition? What attracted you from one to the other?
Well, I actually went via Australia because Australia was host to the 2000 Olympics, and I was invited by the Men Behaving Badly crew from the BBC, who perhaps you know, Martin Clunes and Neil Morrissey, to do a documentary traveling the route of the Olympic torch, basically telling stories of the men of Australia, ironically, Men Behaving Badly, men of Australia. And from there, I decided to make my way to Europe and landed in Brussels and saw the job of my dreams at the time in 2008, which was the head of communications at Digital Europe, and knocked on the door and was first declined. So went back to the headhunter and said, no, you don't understand. This is the job that I'm supposed to be doing. And declined a second time, but never to say no to me. I actually went back to the headhunter a third time. And on the third time, I got lucky and I managed to meet the then Director General of Digital Europe. We hit it off and she hired me, which was amazing. And I had an exceptional entry into Brussels, quite frankly, landing in the largest digital trade association representing all the large and small digital companies from around the world.
Yeah, very, very interesting space to be working on. And then after a couple of different associations, you became a headhunter. So why did you make that transition? Were you frustrated about how you had been headhunted, or you thought this was the right thing for you? What brought you to that?
It was more of an evolution, to be honest. I worked at Digital Europe during a time of tremendous change, which resulted in some reshaping of the organization, and then went into several other trade associations and eventually started working with Dober Partners on doing communications as it related to anti-subsidy, anti-dumping, basically fighting China and its systemic and systematic abusive trade practices. And from there was invited to be a researcher behind the scenes, working with our sister organization in the UK, and then eventually evolved into a fully fledged headhunter of my own, in my own right, thanks to training and mentoring by Mark Dober. So funny world that we end up in, but a very good one and an interesting place to work at the nexus between influencers and influence and of course, some of the brightest and most interesting people that we have in Europe.
So maybe before we talk about what the associations are focusing on now, in your perspective on from this journey where you were there 20 years ago, how do you see the kind of landscape of the association world changing? Has it's been professionalized, it increased in size? What are some of the things that that kind of shock you the most about the changes that you've seen in the profession?
I think, well, over the last 17 years, what we've probably seen is a proliferation of trade associations, big and small. I think the most interesting ones are the one or two women, two men, two-man bands that essentially represent some unique and quite obscure industries, such as the envelope industry or the glue industry for the envelopes and so forth. But overall, I think what has changed is that as Europe has professionalized and the treaties have evolved, so too has the world of influence around those institutions that make laws. So to a large extent, I think what we're seeing is a shift from perhaps old school styles of leadership to more participative leadership, to empowered secretariats that are driven predominantly by the people in them who are high performance people. And I think that has been a slow and important evolution in terms of representation and professionalization. But having said that, you know, where you have bright people, you always have potential. And I think that potential is certainly realized in trade association spaces. There are still, of course, difficult and challenging associations, sometimes due to the nature of the issues that they're dealing with in terms of either environmentally or even reputationally difficult. And of course, you can also have challenging and difficult personalities within those trade associations. But overall, what we've found through our research, whether it's been the remuneration reports or the high performance secretariats, is there's a huge degree of satisfaction and happiness for people or of people that work in European trade associations. So that is testimony to this being, I think, a career choice for people for life.
Yeah, no, very, very interesting. And I like what you said. There's almost an association for everything. I think it's almost like the Apple slogan. There's an app for that. There's an association for any topic that you can think about or haven't thought about, which is quite fascinating. Now, one of the things, you mentioned a high satisfaction in the association world. I'm just curious about how different the association world is from the corporate world, because often it's people who come from a company. There used to be in some associations the perception that people would kind of be moved into the association from the corporate world, maybe it politically to say, okay, we can't fire them, but we keep them in a different environment. How do you see this today? Is it seen as a thing that people do from scratch, like I just want to be in associations, or is it still I come from corporate and I go to an association? And how do how different is the environment in an association versus a company or an institution for that matter?
Well, I think you have to start from what's the objective of a company versus the objective of a trade association. So the objective of a trade association is very clearly to find a common denominator position that can reflect the interests of an entire sector. So therefore, you need to be able to find consensus and agreement around what good looks like for a sector. In a corporate, of course, you are servicing a very simple objective, which is, license to operate and ability to be competitive in an environment which is very, very challenging, and particularly now with what is happening geopolitically around the world. I'm not sure as to whether those people that have transitioned from corporates into trade associations are always that successful, because you have to have a different mentality in a trade association. It's a servant leader type of profile. Edicts from leaders in trade associations rarely go down well. I think what you need to do is take your members, your board, your president on a journey to understand that there is no 100% happiness in a trade association context. What you'd like to try and get to is a manageable, acceptable middle ground that everybody can live with and work with. In a corporate, of course, you have a different metric, and a lot of that requires, I think, internal dialogue, alignment internally, navigating politics internally in a world where today we are seeing regular changes in the corporate landscape. So reshaping of organizations, cost savings in organizations, which creates a much less stable environment than, let's say, in a trade association, where we really do value that institutional knowledge and where you see leaders staying for, up to 10 years or sometimes more. Not that we recommend, 30 years in one job, but nonetheless, you do see that institutional knowledge remaining within an organization because it's valued by the policymakers and certainly valued by the members.
It's very interesting. It's a bit more like a political kind of work where you have to navigate between different people, different opinions, potentially different CEOs, and kind of bring them together. Now, in the association report that you published last week, you were talking about some of the big trends emerging this year for 2026. One of them being, the association needs to do more with less. I feel that this is kind of something that we hear a lot. Is it different this time? Is the pressure much more intense? Or is it just the continuation of the same trend that's been there all along?
I think there are some variables here which perhaps we've never faced before to the same extent. I think there's the Trump effect. There's the Putin effect. There's the challenge that Europe faces in remaining competitive, which play a role in the current set of challenges that we face. And of course, there's this constellation where you're going to have interests which are not necessarily always European interests that need to be balanced with interests from other parts of the world where they have representation in Brussels. And the complexity of that means that you may have an empowered stakeholder community in one part of your membership, which makes things more difficult. So I think we are facing new challenges. I think in addition to that, AI is changing the landscape immeasurably and in ways that we haven't yet begun to totally fathom. So that's a kind of crystal ball exercise. But no, I do think we're facing a almost revolution in terms of the industrial revolution type of new world order that is emerging and that will emerge in the next few years, which will have a direct impact on the world of influence and trade associations and the work that they do in relation to building robust frameworks for industries to operate.
So with these changes, and I'd like to hear if there are other significant changes or trends that you think people need to focus on, but doesn't that seem to invite more change in the association world? You just talked about it being a very stable world where people hired for a long time. Does that mean that people might say, well, for this was the last 2 decades, the profile we needed. Now, maybe we need people who are more flexible, adaptable, who can change faster. Do you think it's going to impact the profile of people that are needed for associations? And what other trends do you think are really significant in 26?
The profile, I think, is blended. I think those people who hang on to the way that they've always done business and hanging on to tight ideas around how we've always and should continue to do things will not necessarily be those that thrive in this world. We're going to have to be more agile. And that means embracing things like new technologies. It means empowering people to do their work. It means thinking in new ways. And that, I think, is going to be the key challenge for any leader of any trade association. It's no longer going to be good enough to bring everybody around the table and say, let's all have a powwow. You're going to have to be thinking a lot more strategically, because in a world where upstream and downstream discussions and cross-sectoral discussions are being had in other regions, you can no longer afford to think in silos. So does that mean we need a total revolution in terms of the profile? No, I think what we need to do is do what human beings do best, which is think laterally, embrace change, enable people or empower people to use new technologies. Don't be afraid to see the world through different lenses, and think about what strategic value you can offer, because the lowest common denominator these days can be done by AI. So therefore, if the basics can be taken care of thanks to technology, what else can you bring to the table that can be measurable, valuable, and affect influence?
I feel that you're kind of describing some almost entrepreneurial characteristics, of being like innovative and changing. Do you think that's a new ingredient that's needed in the association world? Because I think a lot of people would say that the association world is not the most entrepreneurial and innovative around. So do you think that there might be a change in that direction?
Well, I think in a world which is changing, people will inevitably evolve. Do you need to apply entrepreneurial skills? Well, I guess that depends on how you define entrepreneurial. I think people will need to think differently. They will need to evolve their planning. They will need to evolve their strategies. They will need to evolve their approaches, and maybe just challenge themselves to use the technology to get outside of their box, if you see what I mean. It also means, I think, equally listening. You have to understand what is the nature of the problem that you're actually managing or that you need to address. How can you address that differently using technologies, using humans who have technology? So I think to that extent, maybe there will be a revolution, but maybe it's not going to be in the next 24 to 48 hours. I think revolutions happen in degrees. It's always getting the right ingredients and the right things in the right time for the conditions to be ripe for change. So I don't believe in any kind of political context you're going to see suddenly, flipping from the way we've always done business to a new way of doing business. I think we will evolve the way we do advocacy, and we will evolve the way we approach providing services to members in the context of European trade associations, or indeed information to policymakers who are, shall we say, inundated already with information. So it's always going to be about the right information to the right people in the right time, and now in the right way.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, and it's I think another conversation topic, which is, and we heard this during the association discussion, which is the Secretary General has to be the voice of the industry, so they have to communicate personally, but they also have to communicate the story of their industry on a broader scale. And I think if you look at traditional public affairs, it's been a lot about, who do you know, what's your network, who can you have a meeting and coffee with? And then there's been this discussion about, does it need to be more than that? Do you need to have communication skills that allow you to tell a story at a broader level to the media, etc.? So where do you think communication fits in the strategy of an association? How important is it, and how well understood do you think that is today?
I think we're essentially a human-to-human métier, meaning that relationships matter. And the most potent relationships are those that are had before pen hits paper. So if you have those relationships and you can engage in a conversation as a trusted interlocutor, you have this unique ability to shift policy before it even becomes concretized in the form of any even consultation. So that sits very firmly in that strategic leader box. And those relationships are developed at the beginning of one's career and fostered over the course of a career. They're not quick, easy builds. They're long burns. But communications is certainly up there. Communications doesn't replace substance. It's substance plus style, meaning that you have to know what you're doing. You have to know your subject matter to a larger or lesser extent. If you're a leader, perhaps it's more the strategic elements. And if you're working in the minutiae, obviously you need to understand every level of detail and its potential impact. But then being able to tell that narrative, not just for hearts and minds, but also to be able to tell it in a way which resonates with people. So moving from, yes, have your evidence-based, because everything requires evidence in today's world, and the lack of evidential approaches would essentially put you on the back foot. But beyond that, it's the idea of we're essentially humans making laws for societies in which humans live. So if you consider that, you have to consider what makes people want to create rules that are good for your sector or that enable you to be competitive. So I do believe that communications is a very, very important skill for a leader, but in fact, indeed, for any kind of lobbyist at any level.
Yeah, so you talked about the human nature of this profession, and we talked together about AI. So how do you think AI is changing this? I've seen another report which talks about actually confirming some of our informal market research that, the majority of people are trying out different things, but it's not being done very consistently. So what do you think AI is now doing to the public affairs space, and where do you think this is headed?
Well, anybody knows. I think it's a collaborator. It's a tool. It helps us develop new ideas. I believe that it will be integrated as much as email or mobile phones have become integrated in our everyday. I think that inevitably it will speed things up, probably for some too much, for others not enough, depending on whether or not you enjoy the ride. I think the greatest barrier here to human potential is fear. If we look at people who have pushed back on any of the exciting innovations that humans have come up with, those are the ones that get left behind. So I think AI is the great leveler in many ways, because all of a sudden knowledge is in everybody's hands. So it's equal, so long as you have an internet connection and some kind of curiosity. Anybody can access it. You don't need to have a PhD. But I think it is going to be something which will change the nature of work. What does that mean? That means it is an immensely powerful tool in the right hands. And I see the infinite possibilities. And there are, of course, risks, and I'm not suggesting that we should ignore those risks, but I'm an optimist. So I believe that ultimately human beings are capable of yet unimagined potential. So with this tool, if used in the right way, I think we have the capacity and perhaps power, and this is what it's about. It's a tool that empowers human ability to create exciting new horizons in every sense of the word, whether it's in the laws that we create that prepare for a future world, or whether it's in the education system, or indeed whether it's innovations that can help us address some of the grand challenges that we face as societies around the world.
And what are some of the things that you find interesting personally to use AI for? I mean, are there any, do you like to use ChatGPT to write poems, or to define strategy, or what are the things that you are already seeing being quite useful for you?
Well, I like to talk, so I talk to my AI. Probably, I'm not sure if that's because I'm a woman and I like chatting, or just because I'm talkative, but I find it quite iterative in that I can come up with an idea and I can say to it, what do you think? And I can ask it to challenge me in some way. So I'm using it to help create structure, clarity. It's helping me to develop ideas. So for example, when we did this report on high performance secretariats, and I was given 1 week to turn an article on AI around, and I had to speak to everybody and organize it, I needed to do that at great speed. The speed didn't replace the knowledge. What it did is it enhanced my capacity to be able to process the information. I still had to know what I was doing, and I still had to have a very clear editorial view on what I wanted to achieve. But what it helped me do was structure it and get it done at a speed with which I probably wouldn't have been able to in the past, because it was a brand new topic. I had to get a cross-sectoral perspective. So to that extent, it's been a toy, if I could put it like that. The other way is to look at the potential in terms of video, which I haven't yet managed to master. So I'm still working on that, because I'd like to be able to get it to do things that I naturally would have to do, manually, but haven't yet managed to figure out the right tool or indeed the right outcome. So not there yet, but I can see that in the future it'll become far more intuitive and perhaps be able to speed up, if we have an event, being able to get those kinds of audio visual clips out of that event more quickly than it would take me otherwise.
Yeah, what we're observing actually is that using AI tools to do design things, video editing, still takes quite a lot of advanced skills. So you need those skills, and then if you apply them, you can suddenly do things faster and better than you did before. But if you don't understand Adobe, Photoshop, or some of these things, it's not that straightforward because the prompt don't give you that outcome. Now, I think it might happen, but I also suspect that by the time it becomes normalized, then the professional level will be even more interesting and advanced. So I think there is still those technical skills are actually incredibly important, but they allow us, and I think this is what was very important for EU associations, they allow us to tell a story in different ways, often this pretty technical and dry story that becomes, you know, something that you can express through video, through images, through a little animation. So I think perhaps it's going to improve the communication standards in Brussels and the EU from, you know, technocratic to more professional. Which brings me to your background, you know, as a journalist. Obviously, you've been, you know, at the journalist perspective, moving towards the association lens. Now, how do you feel about the evolution of the media in this kind of new information age? Do you see journalists as kind of losing their importance and credibility to the podcasters? You know, the big discussion that took place in the US election was, you know, did Joe Rogan help Donald Trump tip the election because he reached a different audience with a different channel? And the podcasting, male podcasters typically reaching this new audience. So what do you think about the transition of journalism to these new channels? And how does that relate to Brussels, which is a pretty unique kind of environment?
I think that's a very good question and a concerning one. I believe that, at least for the time that I'm alive, that we would continue to rely on trusted sources, because in the absence of that, it becomes simply opinion, and everybody has an opinion. And if they can reach hundreds and thousands or millions of people with that opinion, then their opinion becomes truth, which is not necessarily the case. As a journalist, your job is to objectively try and tell a story. And I remember working for the Special Broadcasting Service as a news journalist, and I was doing the graveyard shift back in the day, which was the kind of 12 o'clock to 5 a.m. And it's exhausting. And it was at the time when Slobodan Milosevic was undertaking his terrible actions. And I remember thinking to myself, what is my role as a journalist? And I had to be very careful to provide a balanced perspective, because the risk that you face is that you can be incendiary. And that's not your job. Your job is to report without fear the truth and to be able to tell a balanced perspective. So I believe there is always a place for journalists. Is it a challenging métier? Yes, it is getting more and more difficult, first of all, because advertising euros or dollars are down, and the pay-by model or paywall model doesn't necessarily always deliver the needed revenue to do good journalism and do investigative journalism, which takes money. You know, it's expensive to pay journalists, it's expensive to do research, and it's expensive to publish, maintenance and what have you. And we publish ourselves, so we know that it is a heavy lift to publish something. In the context of Brussels, I believe that there are some very important platforms for stories to be told. I mean, the obvious are, Euronews and Politico and Euractiv and MLEX and others, where there is a role for the journalist to share information with and for and on behalf of those that have a story to tell. And particularly, for example, when we were talking about anti-dumping and anti-subsidies, when we were doing the solar case back in the day, which was in 2013, it was the biggest trade defense case in the history of trade defense cases in that time. And the media was so important because it put on side of European industry the side of the angels. It defended our interests and right to exist against what were inappropriate practices. So I think that will continue. Will it compete In some cases, yes. Will it replace? I would very much hope not. And if it is replaced, I would hope, again, that in a world where trust is built on the basis of reliability and reputation, that we always go to trusted sources. But in a world where populism is rife and fake news becomes truth, we face a terrible risk that we start to believe the hype and the hyperbole, which is concerning, of course, in a world where we try and keep balances in check.
Now, you painted a pretty rosy picture of journalism looking for the truth and balance. Now, you might want to argue that if you look at Politico and you're active, they have pretty opinionated editorials coming out. And then if you go all the way to The Sun or the Daily Mail or whatever, journalism doesn't always mean searching for the truth. And on the other side, I think if you look at every new study that comes out on media consumption, younger demographic are consuming their news through social media and trust these podcasters more than they do traditional journalism. So I think the trends are there. And some people might argue, look, if the person who is communicating, I mean podcaster as an influencer in general, it seems that the shift is moving from the traditional journalist to these new influencers. I think in Brussels it's probably slower, but it's still happening to some degrees. If you look at the people at the top of the EU influencer ranking that we do annually, it's often a mix of experts and journalists who all have opinions, and of course that they're biased. So my first question is, can you really say that journalists look for the truth, given the I would say fragmented media landscape? And what do you feel about the shift that is happening towards those new types of influencers?
Well, I think you've probably touched upon one of the key questions of our time. What is a good source, and what is a good story? What is a fair story? I still believe, for example, when I read the FT, albeit that I'm reading it with an understanding that it is a certain type of journalist who is appealing to a certain type of audience, that what I read is by and large valuable information that is based on solid ground in terms of research. I do think that we will always have skewed journalism, or indeed telling of stories. If we look back at, the war and who told the stories of the war and who writes history books, it's the victors who write the history books. In terms of the shift, we do have this shift. Do we need to perhaps manage it? I think we will. And whether you do that through codes of conduct or whether you do that through own initiative, those are the questions that we will grapple with over time, because anybody can start a podcast. I guess if you allow for those podcasts to flourish on platforms which remain unregulated or where there is no oversight, of course, you have serious risks to democracy, societies. We have civilizational confrontations that can result. So do I see that as possible? Yes. Would I hope that we as rational, sensible people can implement checks and balances and guardrails? Yes, because I think in a world where technology is going to reign supreme, we're going to have to find and grapple with new ways of managing, because in the absence of that, it's the Wild West. And I think societies have evolved to a point where perhaps we're a little more sophisticated than the savages that lived in caves back in the day when we didn't speak.
Let's hope so. But if you look at the narrative of the populist movements in the US and in other countries, their first strategy is to demonize the press and say not to believe traditional media, and then provide their alternatives. So I think you could argue that in the US, it's already been the idea that there was a media that you could trust is already gone, because they've become politicized. So legacy media is kind of on one side and new media is on another side. I don't think it's quite happened in Europe yet, but I suspect that it's unlikely to kind of buck the trend in the long term. So, because I don't know, I think in the US, every time a journalist challenges the narrative of the administration, the pushback is, this is not a trusted media, this is corrupt or whatever. And I think people then end up believing it. So are you optimistic that we will revert back to the truth as a kind of aspiration for society? Because a lot of people will say that that model is already dead. And we're now in a fragmented space where you just have to choose your camp, but there is no longer a kind of truth that stands out. I don't know where do you stand on that?
This is a super complicated territory. We can live in echo chambers. I think if you want to hear what you want to hear, you can join a WhatsApp group and it'll send you all the information that will reinforce your preconceived notions of how the world is or should be. So I think that is the new reality, and those are very difficult to check. I also believe that there is still a core, sensible, dare I say it, rational community of people, and we will always have this pendulum. I mean, history has always repeated itself. I mean, if you have a look at the Napoleon invading Russia on pretty much the same day as Hitler took on exactly the same route many years later, you get the same result. Do I think that we will change? I think that we will find mechanisms for moderation. And in some cases, we may need to look differently when it comes to the authorities that manage freedom of speech, but also equally hate speech and other social media, which can proliferate disharmony, and we weed that out over time. Is it there yet? No, I don't think it is. And of course, the challenge is there, where you can circumvent through all of these platforms. So to some extent, there's going to be a question around how do we build systems that are robust enough and keep the core of humanity. I mean, because it's world over. This isn't subject just subject to America or Europe. There are emerging worlds where you've got exactly the same challenges. And if we looked at, for example, the Arab Spring, I mean, it was proliferated because of social media. Would it have gone as far and as fast in the absence of social media? Well, one would doubt. I think we're going to have to think very carefully about what the New World Order uses as rules and how it engages with information flows. And we have to provide some kind of protection, particularly to young minds, which are somewhat open to suggestion, whether or not it's radicalization or indeed getting the wrong information without having a full historical context, right? Where we've got complex geopolitical conflicts playing out, particularly today.
Yeah, and talking about the broader narrative, I think I assume from what you're saying that you're broadly pro-European, which I think there's a kind of, in the bubble, that's the kind of dominant opinion. If you read the news today, in the last months or recently, that whole European project is under attack. People are worried. And then there was an interesting piece in the Politico, actually talking about young pro-Europeans. And actually, I think it links to the discussion we had during the EU Influencer event with the new generation of Instagrammers who are actually very passionately pro-European. So my first question to you is, do you think that Europe is under threat, a genuine threat, or is it just one of these things that happens from time to time? And do you think that there is a need and maybe a pro-European movement coming from, I would say, more optimistic and enthusiastic young people? Because what I hear as a narrative, especially from, say, older people, is, a bit of skepticism, a bit of kind of, a little tired, a little worried, and kind of, whereas you have that new energy coming from these younger people who still have optimism and excitement about Europe.
Well, one always hopes that the next generation brings more, better, brighter than the current one. I would hope that if we can make Europe relevant to people's lives and they can feel that relevance, that they will continue to invest in it. The challenge we face is that as the generation of people that live through war and new loss of unparalleled imagination die and that memory fades, of course, that we perhaps forget the reason why this project has been so successful to date. So I think it's about connecting with those young people, making them feel like there's hope, giving them a sense of purpose, giving them a sense of belonging rather than feeling alienated or dismayed or depressed or anxious. And I think the challenge we have at the moment is finding the balance between the two, which is a reality, which is the world is changing fast and we're going to have to adapt. And it's not easy because nobody likes change. And I think hope, because we have to hope. We have to hope because it springs eternal, and the youth are the future. So we hope when we hand them this world, they can make it better.
Yeah, I think there are some green sprouts of optimism, which I find, quite surprising in the dominant narrative that we're facing today. But as a headhunter, you obviously recruit people at quite a high level. But I wonder, when you meet young people who just recently graduated, or even who are about to choose what to study, what is your advice to them in this very chaotic world where we don't know what the future holds, we don't know what AI is going to do? So what's your advice when somebody asks you, what should I do?
Well, let me just start with a statement before I give any advice. The statement is, I'm always so happily impressed by the people that I have the opportunity to meet in my job, particularly the young people. Some of them are so well educated and mature and have a capacity for thinking that I could only have hoped at that age to have. So when I meet these wonderful Europeans that come to Europe, to Brussels to participate in the project, my initial response is, hurrah, right, there is something coming up which is exciting and worth hoping for. So that's the statement. In terms of suggestions and advice, well, the wonderful thing about advice is you can always choose to ignore it. So, take what works for you and ignore what doesn't, as Walt Whitman once said, and your very face shall be a great poem, or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. So actually, to bring it to the level of young people, be like the mother of the dragons in the Game of Thrones. I think.
Okay. How?
Well, I think you need to build deep connections with things that frighten you. Things like AI, for example. It is very much about embracing, not holding yourself back, but leaning in. You have the power. The wonderful thing about AI, again, is it's unleashed and it's in your hands. So, you have this magical thing. Encourage you to master it, to ride the dragon, and that's where the future hope comes from, because it's the future.
You have to survive that big fire and then have these dragon eggs, and then the dragons just listen to what you say. So
nothing's easy,
It's not that straightforward. So what's your second piece of advice?
I think it's age old. It's build trust. In a world where fake is real, keep it real. Keep yourself authentic. Build authentic connections. Build trust. Build a reputation where people know you for who you are and what you do. Say what you do and do what you say. Follow through, I think, is the key word, and deliver. Near enough is not good enough. So I think its basis is trust, and to trust, you have to trust. That's the age-old kind of circular argument there, right? To be trustworthy, you have to trust others. So I would say go into the world with trust. There will be times when you'll be disappointed, but inevitably, the more you trust, the more you are trusted. So I think that's just a basic value in life. So I think probably trust is the core. And then last but not least, in a world where change is inevitable, be agile. Nothing is certain. People who are dogmatic, will struggle, learn to adapt, embrace the unknowns, be fearless. Everything will be fine. It's a roller coaster. Life is always a roller coaster, and frankly, the optimists have more fun. So enjoy the ride, and everything will be fine, so long as you believe it will be fine, and you can adapt and change with the change that is coming, and embrace that.
Very nice. So basically, be courageous and walk through fire. Have integrity. I think that's the real thing, and adapt. So I think three very good pieces of advice.
Recommendations of the week.
So now, what are your recommendations for our listeners?
Well, I'm sure you're already watching and listening to these things. The Daily Beast inside Trump's head, because frankly, I can't fathom what is going on, and somebody needs to explain it to me. The BBC's Americast, I think, is always a good inside track on what's happening, and I think it does give you a global perspective. And then maybe at the foundation, I might just throw something in there. Book I read when I was in my 20s, which was Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. I think we are facing a dystopian possibility. So, you may as well read about it and think about it and figure out how to make it better.
Very popular in Silicon Valley, I think.
Oh, is it? Okay, good to know.
Yes. Well, and then there's the movie, so you have to decide if it does the book justice. But fantastic book recommendations. Thank you so much for sharing these very, very interesting insights. And we will continue our conversation online and in person. So have a fantastic rest of the year. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of the ZNL podcast. Did you like it? If so, please share it on your social media, subscribe, and give us a comment. We will see you again on the next episode. Until then, remember, stay always one step ahead.